Good morning. Welcome. Thank you for being here. Drew, thank you for leading those songs. I really appreciate your work in finding songs that would fit with the lesson today. And that song that you sang, I Need Thee Every Hour, is always special to me. 11 years ago, about right now, I was wrapping up my last trip to Ukraine. And Kip Campbell and I would lead the worship every Sunday, and this was one of their favorite songs, I Need Thee Every Hour, and we would sing it repeatedly. They'd want it at the beginning of the service, they'd want it at the end of the service. Singing simultaneous English and Russian is something that I will always remember in singing that song. So every time we sing it, I have flashbacks to that trip. But thank you for being here. Welcome to our guest. Appreciate you being with us today. Looking forward to studying with you. We are going to begin a new series of lessons this month talking about the pursuit of knowledge. We'll get into that in just a little more detail in a few moments. Dylan, thank you for reading out of Psalm 63. I want to encourage all of you to keep that passage open in your Bible, maybe mark it with the ribbon that you have, because we'll be coming back to it in a few moments. I would, though, before we get started, like to take you to this passage. This is John chapter 4 and verse 34. John 4:34. Here in this passage, Jesus says, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." And so when you read this passage, you ask yourself, to what did Jesus center his life? What was it that became the driving force in the life of Jesus? And as you see the answer there, his food, his very essence of his being, his life is centered around doing the will of his Father. And we ask ourselves, as God's disciples today, do we share the same desire? Do we have the same priority for our own life? You see, for Jesus, there was really nothing more important than doing the will of the Father. Not only do you see it here in John 4:34, but if you go over to the next chapter, John 5, notice what Jesus says, "Truly, truly, I say to you that the Son can do nothing of his own accord, but only what he sees the Father doing." Notice the last sentence of the verse, "For whatever the Father does, that the Son does likewise." Again, I want to ask you, can you say that about your life right now? For whatever the Father does, that is what I am doing. Jesus could say that about his life. Here's another passage just a little bit later in John chapter 5. "I can do nothing on my own. As I hear, I judge, and my judgment is just because I seek not my own will, but the will of him who sent me." God, the Father, is at the center of the life of Jesus. Here's John chapter 6, verse 38. Notice what Jesus says, "For I have come down from heaven, not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." And then Paul is reflecting on the life of Jesus in Romans chapter 15 and verse 3. And he says that Christ did not please himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of those who reproached you fell on me. Jesus was our servant. That's what Paul is teaching there. I tell you, I don't know about you, but passages like what we've just read in John's Gospel, this passage here by Paul in Romans chapter 15, those passages challenge me. I think about my own life. I find myself often in an intense struggle to try to subjugate my will to the Father's. I really struggle with that. And I know I'm not alone because I think it's the human condition. I think we all struggle with subjugating our will to the will of our Heavenly Father. And so that's the challenge. You know, as we go through the remainder of March, what we're going to do is talk about the pursuit of God through the acquisition of spiritual knowledge. As we think about how do we do the will of the Father, well, part of it involves the acquisition of spiritual and biblical knowledge. This is why this is so important. Now, I want to take you back to your vision book for just a moment. And if you look on page 6 of the vision book, you're very familiar by now, surely, with page 6 and 7. And what we're going to be doing during the month of March is talking about the idea of gaining in spiritual knowledge. And I want you to look at those first 4 questions. And I just kind of cut this out of the book and made it into a picture and put it up here on the screen. And I just want you to kind of read through those questions again. I make time to read my Bible every day. I come to Bible class prepared to contribute where possible. I'm working on a list of scriptures to memorize, and then finally, I feel confident in examining teaching and ideas and lifestyles to see if they're consistent with what God says. So those four things, and we've been asking you over the last few months to be kind of examining yourself, and I want to ask you, how'd you score on those things? Is there need for improvement? And in fact, as you look at how you scored yourself on those things, in what areas are you doing well? And then, as you think about what areas am I doing well, then I'm going to look at the other side. In what areas do I really need to improve? And as you look at that, don't just stop there, well, I really need to improve in memorization, or I need to do that. Then let me ask you this, what measures have you taken? What habit goals, what achievement goals have you set in place to actually follow through to measure your success? You see, brothers and sisters, as we studied together this morning, we're talking about the pursuit of knowledge. But before we dive into that for the remainder of the month, what we're talking about today is something that is foundational to the pursuit of knowledge. And that is our desire for God. You see, our attitude, our yearning for Him, our spiritual frame of mind, that is something that should be growing to the point within us that it dominates who we are. It is all-encompassing of what we do in life. It drives everything. My passion for God, my drive for God. I want to know God. I want to be with God. I want to serve Him more. That's what underlies all of this. You see, this intense desire, this hunger, I believe, the older I get, that it has become a fundamental challenge for Christians in the United States. I think when I look around in today's church in the U.S., and I'm speaking generally, it's not applicable everywhere, but I think largely we have become self-satisfied. Some of us lack urgency. Some of us, as we think about our spiritual lives, we started out enthusiastically, we started out well, but now we've kind of coasted and faded. And now that the joy and the anticipation that was there at the beginning of our spiritual life has now largely kind of drifted into spiritual malaise, and even in some rarer situations, cynicism. And this is the condition of the American church in a lot of things. I want you to think for a moment. Here in a minute, we're going to be in Matthew 5:6. Do you remember what that passage says? Matthew chapter 5, verse 6. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. Do you remember that? Matthew 5:6. Open that passage up a few days ago, and somewhere in my Bible study notes, I don't know if I was sitting in someone's Bible class or I was listening to someone preach or what, but somewhere along the line I've put some notes in my study Bible, and I asked myself these questions. What are some harmless things that are taking the edge off of my spiritual appetite? Maybe things in and of themselves that aren't so bad, maybe they're good in and of themselves, but those things too much can lead me to where I'm so full and content that my desire, my hunger for God is really not where it should be. I ask myself this question, am I disciplining myself daily to be reminded of the daily pursuit of righteousness? And have I become like Jesus, where life is about doing the will of God? Life is all about His will. Listen, if I am going to pursue God, if I'm going to pursue the knowledge of Him, I have got to make sure that my desire for God, my longing for God is where it needs to be. I think sometimes in the church what we have done is we've concentrated on the pursuit of intellectual knowledge about God without understanding the real purpose behind it. Listen, we have trivia and we have facts and figures and this and that and whatever else that we memorize just for the fact that we can tell somebody else we know about God and His Word. And that's all good, and I'm not against any of it. But there's a deeper purpose. There's something higher behind it that we need to grasp and hold on to. So today what we're going to do is lay the foundation for where we're going for the remainder of the month. We're going to do this by examining two passages. One is Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6, and the other passage is Psalm 63. And what we're going to do today is very simple. We're going to talk about what it means to hunger and thirst after righteousness. Then we're going to go to the Psalm, and we're going to talk about David's personal identification with God. We're going to talk about his desire for God above life itself. And we're going to talk about how David built his relationship with God during the good times so that he could be sustained during the more challenging times of his life. So that's our plan. On the back page of your bulletin is an outline. It has some fill in the blanks and some answers on the side. There's a little slot where you can take some notes. Use that this morning as we study together. So let's first go to Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. I want to spend a few moments just talking about some basics here. What does it mean to have a desire for God? Here in this passage, Jesus talks about hungering and thirsting for righteousness. Now, I'm going to put this on the screen. Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied." Those two verbs there are together. And there's a reason why I did the fill in the blank, hunger and thirst. Those two verbs are used to describe a hunger of the greatest possible intensity. I think it is extremely difficult for us to really relate to what it means to be genuinely hungry and genuinely thirsty. Because, I don't know what it means to be hungry, really hungry, okay? Can't you tell? All right? So, and if that's me, all right, and I look around the audience, not a one of us really know what it means to be truly, desperately hungry and desperately thirsty. I'll tell you, when I think of being thirsty, I think of how I feel after I've just rode my bike for 30 miles, and I come back and I'm dry and I'm parched, all right? But I've never been so dry and parched that I'm to the point of death. I've never been so hungry that my life was in danger. But what Jesus is talking about here in this passage, he is talking about the idea of desperation, being to the point I am longing for righteousness, I am longing for God to the point of absolute, total desperation. Half a century ago, Major Gilbert wrote a book about his experience in World War I. 100 years ago, the British were liberating Palestine. And in the book called The Last Crusade, he describes the experience of troops who got too far ahead from their water supply. And I want you to indulge me for just a few moments. I want to share with you an excerpt from the chapter where he details the experience of these soldiers. He says, "The reserve water for the army was carried in copper cisterns called fanatis, and each holding around 15 gallons. These metal tanks are suspended by rings from each side of the camel's pack saddle, 30,000 camels being employed for this purpose alone." He goes on in his writing to say the pack camel is a very slow-moving creature, especially when he is fully loaded. It was of the greatest importance that the infantry should follow up with the recent victory with all speed to prevent the enemy from reorganizing. Therefore, we soon outdistanced our camel water convoy, lost touch with them, and marched for a whole day without water. The day previous, we had half a bottle of drinking water each, and the following day, our bottles hung empty at our sides. That day turned out to be the hottest of the year. He says, "Our hearts ached, and our eyes became bloodshot and dim in the blinding glare reflecting from the sand. After a time, our tongues began to swell so that they seemed to fill the insides of our mouths, which had gone dry. It was with difficulty that we could speak. Our lips commenced to swell, and they turned a purplish black and burst, and sand blew in the open cuts, and flies persistently settled on the wounds, driving us almost mad. Some of the men went temporarily blind from the glare of the sun and the sand and the lack of water, and a few fell out on the wayside, and these we never saw again." He goes on in his book to describe the battle. He says, "On the morning of November the 6th, with no news of our missing camel convoy, the attack on Sharia was launched. We all knew the wells of Sharia and what they contained, and unless we captured this place before nightfall, many of us would die of thirst. The Turks were holding on to Sharia like grim death. because they realized that if they gave it up, they would have to retreat over many miles of desert with a depleted transport. We fought that day as men fight for their lives. Wave after wave of infantry went forward, only to break on the enemy's guns, reform again, and advance once more toward its objective. He goes on to say, I was observing through my field glasses when the final and successful assault took place, but could see nothing as my eyes became blurred and useless. Finally, we entered Sharia Station, practically on the heels of the retreating Turks. The first objects that met our view were the great stone cisterns in the station yard filled with tons of cold, clear drinking water. He goes on to say, in the still night air, the sound of water running in tanks could be distinctly heard, maddening in its tantalizing nearness. Yet not a man murmured when orders were given for various battalions to be fallen in line, 2 deep, facing the stone cisterns, while the wounded and the animals were led away on a separate place set aside for transport. Then came the officers and the men, detailed for outpost duty, who would have to guard the camp all that night. These were given water first. The remainder of us fell in by companies, officers in the ranks with their men, shoulder to shoulder. It took 4 hours before the last man had a drink of water, and in all that time, we had just been standing about 7 yards from a low stone wall on the other side of which were thousands of gallons of water, yet not a single man broke from the ranks or tried to get a drink out of his turn. I shared that with you because I guarantee you none of us sitting in this room have ever experienced thirst like that. We don't know what it means to be thirsty, and that is the level of thirstiness that Jesus is describing in Matthew chapter 5 and verse 6. And I want to take you back to that text there in that passage. This is what he's describing, something strong, something intense, something where there's a deep longing for relief. And notice as you read this passage here, the verbs are written in present continuous tense. They describe an ongoing, continuous, moment-by-moment desire. Now again, I want to make the application, brothers and sisters. Does that type of intensity describe us? Or does it come, when it comes to spiritual truth, does it just feel like we can take it or leave it? Have we just relegated God to a weekend hobby? Is God nothing more than a family tradition? I am the 3rd generation of New Testament Christians in my family. My kids will be the 4th. It's something I kind of take a little pride in. 4 generations. Some of you have more than that. Is it just that? Is it just a family tradition? Is it just a checkbox that we use to congratulate ourselves on our own morality? Listen, again, we are largely satisfied. And I think we are very distracted. We struggle to focus on one thing. Many of us have divided affections. The material always is pulling at us to look away from the eternal. And then we tend to divide our life into little parcels where we access them only as we have need. The pursuit of God and knowledge is something that we can kind of relegate over here to the side and only pull it out when we need to. Especially when times are good, when times are comfortable, and times are smooth. And I want to tell you right now, brothers and sisters, that is dangerous. That's dangerous. We need to really be examining ourselves to see if we are truly hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Now, I want to look at David for a few moments, and this is where we go back to Psalm 63. Because I think when we look at Psalm 63, we can talk about David's devotion and worship. The heading, if you have your Bible open to Psalm 63, the heading there over the Psalm says that this was written while David was in the wilderness of Judah. And so before we dive into the psalm itself, I want to give you just a little bit of background concerning it. And maybe there are little clues inside Psalm 63 where David gives us some hint about the situation he was in. If you go first to verse 4, he says that I am going to bless God, notice, as long as I live. And you could read into that maybe David's life is in danger. Maybe he doesn't know if tomorrow he may die. If you go down to verse 9, he talks about people who are trying to destroy his life. So things are not going well for David. At least at this point, it seems that someone is chasing him while he is in the wilderness. If you go down to verse 11, he talks here about being the king. Okay, so all this, being in the wilderness, fleeing for his life, having someone chasing him, it seems to be happening while he is king. So we have kind of put this together that this must be describing the time he was fleeing from Absalom. Absalom has launched a coup. He has taken over the palace in Jerusalem. David has had to flee for his life. And if we go back to verse 1, we find that David is in a dry and weary land where there is no water. 2 Samuel 15 says that David fled Jerusalem by crossing the brook of Kidron and moved out into the wilderness. And so that's where he is in this psalm. It's a dark time. It's a time that has forced him to kind of go back to reality. This is a point where he is literally reaching out for God. He is stretching. He is looking desperately for spiritual and emotional strength. So I want to take you back to verse 1 and notice how David approaches God. And look at the first part of what he says. "O God, you are my God. You are my God." That's the first thing he does. He identifies himself with his God. Everything is spiraling out of control. It's like standing in quicksand. The harder he moves around, the harder he fights back, the worse it gets. And so he is looking for stability, and he puts his stability on this rock-solid truth. God is my God. I'll tell you what he's thinking. He is thinking that there is no one else or no other thing that I can cast my burden on except my God. God is my God. And his God was going to be there to meet his need. And so everything else in Psalm 63 is based on the fact that Yahweh is David's God. Now notice also here, as you look at verse 1, not only does David get his bearings straight about his personal relationship with God, where he says, God, you are my God, but notice also here, he desires God earnestly. He says, earnestly I seek you. Now some of the older versions say, early I will seek you, right? Some have taken this to say, well, this is a psalm that should be recited in the morning or something like that. Well, okay, I guess. Some of the newer versions use the word earnestly here, and basically, whether you take it early or earnestly, whatever your translation is, the point is desperately seeking God. And again, I want you to see an intense, physical longing for God. And in fact, he goes on to say here, my soul thirsts for you. Not a thirst for the gifts of God, but a thirst for God himself. David has a heart for God. David has a taste for fellowship with God. And listen, as we study about the pursuit of knowledge during the month of March, if we don't start this with an intense desire for God himself, then our pursuit of knowledge is going to be empty. I just think about that for a moment. Listen, we did not come here to Bible class today and worship only for the intellectual pursuit. We are not here today to reinforce how much we're right versus how much wrong everyone else is. We are here today as humble and broken sinners who are savoring God for the sweetness and excellence of who he is. And so as you read verse 1, this is an intense longing for God. And it is something that we see over and over and over again in the pages of the Old Testament. And yet, what is interesting about this, you look at the Old Testament writers, they had far less revealed to them about God, about the eternal, about the heavenly reward than we do. We have the completed word. We have the inspired revelation to guide us. They didn't largely. C.S. Lewis in his writing has talked about this. These poets knew far less reason than we for loving God. They did not know that he offered them eternal joy, still less that he would die to win it for them. Yet they express a longing for him for his mere presence, which comes only to the best of Christians or to the Christians in their best moments. They long to live all their days in the temple so that they may constantly see the fair beauty of the Lord. Their longing to go up to Jerusalem and appear before the presence of God is like a physical thirst. And from Jerusalem, his presence flashes out in its perfect beauty. Lacking that encounter with him, their souls are parched like a waterless countryside. That's the Old Testament writers, having far less than we do today, and yet they have this desperate longing for God. So I ask you again today, what are you seeking satisfaction in? And as we think collectively, maybe this explains why so many people today are relatively weak in the Lord's church, because they are seeking things other than God. Now, look at where David's object is here. Look at verse 3. He says, your steadfast love is better than what? Life. Your steadfast love is better than life. Listen, David wanted God more than the joys of life. And so must we. We need to desire God more than our family, more than our health, or more than food, or more than sex, or the career that we have, or our home, our entertainment and recreation. We need to enjoy God more than sports, or nature, or anything that is in this world. David is saying here in this passage that the love of God is better than life itself, and it is better than the beauty of all the things that God gives us. You know, Friday, and even into yesterday as I went back over this, I got to thinking about how often I keep my sight lowered and my focus more on sometimes the beauty of God's gifts rather than yearning for the greater beauty of God himself. Notice he says, your steadfast love is better than life. You know, and I think sometimes it takes us going through the wilderness to really get that. So here is David. He's out in the wilderness. He's in the greatest storm of his life. He's digging deep, and he's struggling to stand firm. And so he does, as you keep on going here, and he does by looking at God in his past and in his present and in his future. How do I know this? Well, go back with me, if you will, to verse 2. David looked back and he saw God moving in his past. Look at verse 2. So I have looked upon you in the sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. So David is looking back. Here he is out in the desert. He's a long way from the temple in Jerusalem. But here he is remembering those times, in the good times, in the comfortable times, when he could go inside the temple sanctuary and worship God there, and he drew power from that. He drew strength from that. Brothers and sisters, don't take what you are doing today in this place for granted. There is power here. There is the glory of God here in this. Draw your strength from it, because there may be a day where you won't be able to worship in a place like this. You know, this afternoon, we're going to go do some singing for some of our older ones that haven't been able to get out for a long time and come to worship. I think of Kermit and Isabel, Ronnie Gallagher, Mike Wilson. Those are just a few of the ones we're going to visit today. And we're going to sing to them. But you know, every one of those individuals that I just mentioned, there was a time in their life where they probably could not have imagined getting to this point in their life where they are no longer able to come out and worship. And yet, they can draw back on those times and remember the strength and remember the power of God that they experienced in that. And brothers and sisters, you could be doing that here in this place today. This is David doing that. The remembrance of that fills him with clarity. It reminds him of God's power. And it actually becomes for him a feast out in the wilderness. And he holds on to those precious moments of joy that he experienced in his worship while he was in the temple. And notice how this demonstrates his devotion. And it doesn't wane. That preparation before helped him during the time of difficulty, and that empowered him in the present. Because in the present, because of what he's experienced in the past, he can say what he does in verse 3, your love is better than life. He can say what he does in verse 6, I remember you on my bed and meditate on you in the watches of the night. He can say what he does in verse 7, you are my help. He can say what he does in verse 8, your right hand upholds me. Because he's totally devoted to God. And that realization, that total devotion, that hunger for God motivates him to look ahead to the future, where he says, my soul will be satisfied as with fat and rich food. Look at the second part of verse 5. My mouth will praise you with joyful lips. He anticipates a future time when he can do that in the presence of God. Look at verse 11. He anticipates a future time when he will be delivered from the present distress. The king will rejoice in God, and all who swear by him will exult, for the mouths of liars will be stopped. Brothers and sisters, there is a deep purpose behind what we're doing in this building this morning. Here, in our corporate worship, we are able to taste and feel and experience the power and glory of God. And we are able to savor God for who He is. And everything we are doing here this morning is God-centered. It is not about the song leader. It is not about the scripture reader. It is not about the preacher. It is not about the elders. It is not about the deacons. It is about God Himself. And we don't treat it lightly because we can't. It is at the very center of our life. It's intense. It's earnest. And so we have gathered ourselves together today in silence, and we have filled ourselves with reverence and awe. And brothers and sisters, as we prepare to leave here in just a few moments, may we be able to say along with David, so I have looked in your sanctuary, beholding your power and glory. We began our study in John 4. My food is to do the will of Him who sent me and to accomplish His work. What is at the center of your life? Any pursuit of spiritual knowledge begins from genuine hungering and thirsting for God Himself and from the righteousness that it brings. And notice here, what's the promise in verse 6? Matthew 5:6. Those who hunger and thirst after righteousness will be satisfied. And so my question for you as we close this morning is very simple. Are you so devoted to God that even when you're out there in the wilderness, you can say, God, your steadfast love is better than life. God, your love is better than anything here, better than anything temporary, better than anything material. Notice what Jesus promised just 20 verses earlier in the same chapter in John 4. He says, whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life. So what we have here today, what we are doing here today, is of the utmost importance. We did not come here today to be entertained. We did not come here today for what we could get out of it. We came here to give to God what we could, to reverence Him, to hold Him in awe, to put Him and exalt Him into His proper place. This is why Sunday is the best day of the week, because it really allows us to have a reset and get our priorities where they need to be, so that we can begin the week from here, serving the Lord, keeping Him at the center of our heart and mind, so that we can bring Him glory through the week. My heart thirsts for you. That's what David said. And may that be said for us. If you're with us this morning, you've been wandering around in the desert. You've been looking, you've been searching, and you just can't find relief. You've been looking at all the things that the world promises. You've gone down certain pathways, and you've tried certain roads, and you've done certain things, and you've looked at other religions, or you've done this, or you've done that, and you just can't find it. Let me tell you, the answer is found in Jesus. It's found by searching for God through the pages of His Word and finding that hope and that deliverance that is promised, with that knowledge that can be gained that, yes, I can go home. Yes, there is more to this life than this life. I can be with God in the one to come, and I can be with Him through all eternity. That's the message of the gospel. Jesus came, He died so that we could live. He was resurrected on the third day. He is now reigning in heaven at the right hand of God, and one day He will come again to get us and take us home, and we will be with Him forever. What a glorious thought. Amen? If you're not ready for that, then now's the time. We'd love to help you get started in that journey. Have your thirst quenched this morning by the river that comes forth from our God. If we can serve you in any way, why don't you come forward as we stand and sing.